The moment he stepped into the boarding area, no one realized they were dismissing the man who owned the very system they were standing in. Ethan Caldwell moved calmly through the bright terminal of Meridian International Airport, carrying nothing but a small black carry-on and wearing a simple navy jacket over a plain white shirt that gave no hint of status or wealth. Around him, the airport pulsed with the usual rhythm of travel, rolling suitcases, boarding announcements, the distant hum of aircraft preparing for departure. Yet in the eyes of those working the gate, he was just another passenger blending into the crowd. At the boarding checkpoint for Flight 248 to Chicago, a young airline representative named Olivia Carter glanced up from her screen and immediately narrowed her eyes at Ethan's understated appearance, subtly signaling to a colleague that something about him did not match the polished image of the priority passengers she was used to handling. Behind her, a man in a tailored gray suit named Brandon Hayes, a frequent flyer who enjoyed reminding staff of his importance, noticed Ethan standing in the priority lane and let out a quiet, dismissive chuckle, leaning slightly toward another traveler as if sharing an inside joke without saying a word. The atmosphere at the gate remained polite on the surface, but small gestures began to build an unspoken wall around Ethan, a hesitation in greetings, a delay in scanning his boarding pass, a brief pause before addressing him that felt heavier than it should have. Ethan said nothing, his expression steady. His posture relaxed in a way that seemed almost out of place in the rushed energy around him, as if time itself moved differently for him. When Olivia finally approached him, her tone was efficient but clipped, asking him to step aside for additional verification. Despite his ticket clearly showing first-class priority boarding, and without offering any explanation that would justify the delay, Brandon Hayes, now watching more openly, shook his head slightly and muttered that some people tried to push their way into spaces they didn't belong, a comment that drew a few faint smirks from nearby passengers who were unaware of the situation's full context. Ethan simply shifted his bag to his other hand and waited, his eyes briefly scanning the gate monitors, the boarding staff, and the flow of passengers as though he were observing a system he already understood far beyond their perception. Minutes passed, and the delay stretched longer than it should have, the subtle discomfort growing as Olivia returned twice with the same vague excuse that something was still processing, while avoiding direct eye contact. A boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, signaling that priority boarding would soon close, and yet Ethan remained where he was, neither arguing nor retreating, his silence becoming more noticeable than any complaint could have been. It was at that moment that Marcus Bennett, the security supervisor overseeing the gate, stepped closer with a professional but curious expression, sensing that the situation was not following standard procedure. Ethan finally spoke, not in frustration but in a calm, measured tone, confirming his identity once again and asking simply whether there was an issue with the system, a question that caused Olivia to hesitate for the first time, her confidence faltering just slightly. The air around the boarding area seemed to tighten, not from conflict, but from the growing realization that something about this passenger did not fit the assumptions being made about him, and yet no one could yet see how deeply mistaken those assumptions were. The tension at the boarding gate had shifted from casual indifference to quiet uncertainty, as if the space itself had begun to question the assumptions made only moments earlier. Ethan Caldwell remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression steady in a way that did not seek attention but naturally held it. Around him, the flow of passengers continued, yet subtle disruptions began to form in the routine behavior of the airline staff. Olivia Carter returned to her workstation, her fingers moving across the keyboard faster than before, repeating the verification process as though speed could replace certainty. Brandon Hayes, still nearby, leaned against a column with an expression that tried to remain amused, but his eyes lingered longer on Ethan now, studying him with a curiosity that had replaced his earlier confidence. Marcus Bennett stepped closer to the boarding desk, reviewing the situation with a trained awareness that came from years of managing unpredictable airport dynamics, his gaze alternating between Ethan and the system screen that Olivia was now visibly struggling with. The delay in confirmation was no longer something easily dismissed, and the quiet pauses between each interaction grew heavier, stretching the atmosphere in a way that made even routine announcements feel distant. Ethan finally shifted his gaze toward Olivia, not in challenge, but in calm inquiry, asking whether the verification process required additional documentation, or whether there was an issue within the system itself. His tone carried no frustration, only clarity, and that absence of emotion made the situation feel even more unusual to those observing. Olivia hesitated before responding, offering a polite but vague explanation about a temporary flag in the system that required manual clearance, though her voice lacked the certainty it had carried earlier. Marcus stepped forward at that point, requesting to review the boarding credentials directly, his professional demeanor softening slightly as he scanned the information displayed on the tablet. A brief silence followed as his eyes moved across the screen, and for the first time, the confidence in the gate area seemed to shift away from assumption and toward verification. Brandon Hayes, sensing the change but not understanding its source, crossed his arms and muttered that first-class passengers should not face delays like this, attempting to reassert his earlier stance. Yet his words now sounded less certain, more performative than confident. Ethan remained composed, adjusting his grip on his carry-on bag, his attention moving briefly toward the boarding corridor where passengers were beginning to queue for final call. The ambient noise of the terminal continued, but within the immediate space of the gate, the rhythm felt altered, as if the normal flow of authority had been quietly interrupted. Olivia spoke again, this time softer, stating that the system might require authorization from a higher level due to an internal discrepancy that was still being resolved. Marcus did not respond immediately, instead rechecking the credentials with a slower, more deliberate focus, his earlier casual curiosity now replaced with analytical attention. The nearby passengers, once only casually observant, began to notice the unusual length of the delay, some glancing between the staff and Ethan with growing curiosity. Ethan finally broke the silence with a simple question, asking how long the verification would take, his voice steady and controlled, not pressing, but clearly signaling that time was becoming a factor. Olivia opened her mouth to respond, but paused when Marcus raised his hand slightly, indicating that he had found something in the system that required confirmation beyond the gate level. For the first time, Brandon Hayes shifted his weight away from the column, his earlier confidence fading into uncertainty as he tried to interpret the subtle change in staff behavior. The atmosphere, once defined by quiet dismissal, now carried an unspoken acknowledgment that the situation was no longer routine, and that the assumptions made earlier might not align with what was now being revealed through the system itself. The atmosphere at the boarding gate had now shifted into a state of controlled uncertainty, where every movement felt measured and every word carried more weight than before. Ethan Caldwell remained exactly where he was, his presence steady and unchanged, as if the unfolding situation had not altered his internal sense of timing at all. Marcus Bennett stood slightly closer to the verification screen, his eyes scanning the updated system response with growing focus, while Olivia Carter stood beside him, visibly aware that the explanation she had given earlier was no longer sufficient to describe what the system was now revealing. A faint ripple of attention moved through nearby passengers as they noticed the staff's posture changing, subtle adjustments in tone and movement that suggested the situation had moved beyond a routine boarding process. Brandon Hayes, who had previously maintained a posture of casual superiority, now watched more carefully, his expression no longer confident but restrained, as if recalibrating his understanding of what he was witnessing. Marcus finally spoke in a lower voice, asking Olivia to confirm the status of the boarding authorization against the secondary clearance layer, a step that was rarely required for standard first-class passengers. Olivia hesitated before responding, her fingers pausing briefly above the keyboard, then explaining that the system had triggered a restricted profile verification due to a mismatch in authorization hierarchy. The phrasing immediately changed the tone at the gate, introducing a level of procedural seriousness that had not been present earlier. Ethan remained silent, observing without interruption, his gaze occasionally shifting toward the boarding corridor where final passengers were now being guided toward the aircraft. The delay announcement echoed once again through the terminal, but this time it felt less like a routine update and more like a confirmation that something unusual was unfolding behind the scenes. Marcus reviewed a second screen, cross-referencing data points with increasing precision, and his expression gradually transitioned from curiosity to recognition, though he did not yet verbalize what he was seeing. Olivia, sensing the shift, stepped slightly back from the terminal interface, as if creating space for interpretation she was no longer confident in providing. Brandon Hayes attempted to reinsert himself into the situation by questioning why a single passenger could cause such a disruption in boarding flow, but his words were softer now, lacking the earlier certainty that had defined his tone. Ethan finally broke his silence with a simple clarification, asking whether the delay was procedural or administrative. His voice calm and measured, carrying no trace of frustration but a clear expectation of clarity. Marcus acknowledged the question but did not answer immediately, instead requesting direct confirmation from the airline operations channel, a step that required elevated access and briefly paused all other processing at the gate. The surrounding environment seemed to tighten further as attention concentrated around the boarding desk, passengers now openly observing rather than casually noticing. Olivia received a response from the system moments later, her eyes widening slightly as she read the updated classification that had just been returned, and for the first time, she looked directly at Ethan with a change in expression that suggested reconsideration rather than procedure. Marcus exhaled slowly, stepping half a pace back from the screen as the confirmation data aligned with internal records he had not expected to encounter in this context. The earlier assumptions made at the gate were no longer supported by the system information now visible, and the contrast between perception and verified status created a silent recalibration among the staff. Ethan adjusted his posture slightly, still composed, still patient, but now clearly aware that the environment around him had begun to shift in understanding. The boarding line behind him remained orderly, yet the emotional tone of the gate had changed completely, moving from casual dismissal to structured attention. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice more formal than before, indicating that the boarding clearance would require immediate authorization from the Airline Operations Center due to elevated priority classification. Marcus confirmed this quietly, his attention now fully aligned with the updated system status, while Brandon Hayes stood in silence, no longer attempting commentary as he processed the implications of what was being confirmed. The gate, once filled with routine motion, now held a stillness defined by realization, as the earlier assumptions about the passenger standing calmly at the boarding line no longer matched the verified data displayed on the screen. The moment the system confirmation stabilized across the boarding interface, the entire energy at the gate shifted again, this time in a way that could not be mistaken for uncertainty alone, but rather a quiet recognition that the situation required escalation beyond standard procedure. Marcus Bennett held his position near the terminal screen, his attention fixed on the updated classification now displayed in a secure field that had not been visible earlier, while Olivia Carter stood slightly behind him, her hands now resting still as she read the same information with a level of focus that replaced her earlier procedural confidence. Ethan Caldwell remained in place, observing without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his awareness clearly aligned with the fact that the system was no longer treating him as an ordinary passenger in any capacity. Brandon Hayes, who had previously tried to maintain a position of detached superiority, now appeared noticeably quieter, his earlier posture softened as he looked between the staff and the screen, as if trying to reconcile what he believed with what was now being officially recorded. Marcus finally initiated a direct communication channel to the Airline Operations Center, his voice calm but precise as he requested immediate verification of the elevated clearance status associated with the passenger in question. A brief pause followed as the request was transmitted, during which the surrounding environment seemed to compress into a narrow field of silence, where even the ambient noise of the terminal felt distant and less relevant. Olivia glanced at Ethan again, her expression now carrying a visible shift from earlier doubt to careful reassessment, as if the information she had relied on before no longer fully applied. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, not out of urgency, but in response to the extended delay, his calm demeanor remaining consistent even as the procedural attention around him intensified. The communication channel finally returned a response, and Marcus listened without interruption, his expression gradually tightening in concentration as he absorbed each line of confirmation being delivered through the secure line. Without speaking immediately, he acknowledged the instructions with a brief nod and ended the call, then turned slightly toward Olivia, indicating that the boarding process required immediate procedural adjustment in accordance with the updated authorization tier. Olivia began inputting the revised clearance. Manually, her movements now more careful, reflecting the awareness that any error at this stage would carry system-wide implications for the boarding cycle. Brandon Hayes took a small step back from the immediate area of the desk, his earlier commentary fully absent now, replaced by a silent observation that no longer carried judgment but uncertainty. Marcus then turned his attention toward Ethan directly, addressing him in a more formal tone than before, acknowledging that the system had verified an elevated operational classification that required expedited boarding protocol without further delay. The words were delivered with professional precision, yet they carried an undeniable shift in how Ethan was now being perceived within the structure of the airport system. Ethan responded with a simple acknowledgment, his tone unchanged, neither emphasizing nor diminishing the significance of what had just been confirmed. Around them, the gate area subtly reorganized itself in response to the updated directive, with staff adjusting positions and preparing to resume boarding under the revised priority structure. Olivia stepped slightly aside from the terminal after completing the update, her attention now focused on ensuring the gate flow would proceed without further disruption, while Marcus coordinated with a nearby associate to reopen the boarding corridor. The passengers who had been waiting nearby began to move forward again, though the earlier sense of casual routine had been replaced by quiet curiosity, as several of them now looked toward Ethan with renewed attention, sensing that something about the situation had fundamentally changed. Brandon Hayes remained silent, his earlier assumptions no longer expressed, as he watched the boarding lane reopen and the staff adjust their posture around Ethan in a way that subtly acknowledged his corrected status. Ethan finally took a step forward toward the boarding corridor, still calm, still composed, his carry-on held at his side, as the environment that had once dismissed him now aligned itself to accommodate him without hesitation. The transition was smooth and procedural, yet beneath its surface lay a clear transformation in perception, as those who had initially overlooked him were now operating under a very different understanding of his presence at the gate. As Ethan Caldwell crossed the threshold of the boarding corridor, the shift in atmosphere became even more pronounced, not through any announcement or visible gesture, but through the subtle behavior of those responsible for the gate operations. The staff who had previously questioned, delayed, and verified now adjusted their positions in a coordinated manner that reflected full compliance with the updated authorization protocol. Marcus Bennett remained near the boarding control interface, ensuring that the transition to expedited processing was executed without interruption, while Olivia Carter moved ahead to coordinate with the flight attendants stationed at the aircraft entrance. Ethan walked at a steady pace, neither hurried nor hesitant, his carry-on remaining at his side as the corridor lighting reflected softly across the polished floor beneath him. Behind him, the boarding queue resumed in an orderly flow, though the emotional tone among nearby passengers had shifted noticeably, with several now observing him in silence rather than passing casual judgment. Brandon Hayes followed at a distance, no longer attempting to insert commentary or maintain earlier assumptions, his expression now replaced with a restrained focus as he watched the unfolding change in protocol. At the aircraft entrance, a flight attendant confirmed Ethan's boarding status after a brief verification on a handheld device, then immediately stepped aside with a professional acknowledgment that required no further explanation. Olivia arrived moments later, confirming the expedited clearance with a quiet exchange that finalized the transition from gate to aircraft access. And for the first time, the boarding process for Ethan proceeded without delay or question. As he approached the aircraft door, the environment around him had fully transitioned from procedural uncertainty to structured recognition, where every interaction now reflected confirmed status rather than assumption. Marcus observed from the gate entrance, his role in the process effectively complete, though his attention remained on Ethan as he boarded, noting the stark contrast between the initial treatment and the final authorization now governing his passage. Olivia returned briefly to the terminal side, where she finalized system updates to ensure consistency across all boarding records, her earlier hesitation now replaced with professional clarity. Brandon Hayes, standing near the corridor entrance, remained silent as Ethan disappeared into the aircraft, his earlier perspective now visibly unsettled, not by confrontation, but by the realization that the assumptions made at first glance had been entirely incorrect. The boarding corridor gradually returned to its normal rhythm, passengers continuing forward in sequence, yet the staff's demeanor reflected a lasting adjustment in awareness, as the incident had quietly redefined the context of expectation at the gate. Inside the aircraft entryway, Ethan paused briefly as a flight attendant directed him toward his seat in the forward cabin, maintaining the same calm presence he had carried throughout the entire sequence of events. There was no visible reaction from him to the change in treatment, no acknowledgment of contrast, only continued forward motion guided by procedure and confirmation. As he moved into the cabin, the aircraft environment transitioned back to its standard pre-departure state, yet the memory of the boarding process lingered among those who had witnessed it, shaping quiet conversations and reflective glances in the moments that followed. The system that had once delayed him now fully aligned to his presence without hesitation, completing the final stage of verification that had transformed an ordinary boarding sequence into an unmistakable correction of misjudgment. Inside the aircraft cabin, the atmosphere had returned to its structured calm, yet something subtle lingered beneath the surface, an awareness among those seated nearby that the man who had just boarded was not treated like an ordinary passenger, even if no one fully understood why. Ethan Caldwell moved down the aisle with measured steps, guided by a flight attendant who maintained professional composure while subtly adjusting her tone with a level of respect that was not present earlier at the gate. The seating area in the forward cabin was quiet, with passengers already settled, but a few glanced up briefly as Ethan passed, noticing the absence of any confusion or delay that had defined his earlier boarding experience. He reached his assigned seat and placed his carry-on in the overhead compartment without assistance, then sat down with the same calm presence he had maintained throughout the entire process. Across the aisle, a passenger lowered a magazine slightly, observing him with mild curiosity, while further back another passenger leaned toward a companion, speaking in a low voice that suggested the earlier events at the gate had already become a topic of quiet discussion. The flight attendants continued their pre-departure checks, moving with efficiency, but occasionally their attention shifted toward the forward cabin where Ethan was seated, as if confirming alignment between procedure and system status. Marcus Bennett remained outside the aircraft, coordinating final boarding closure, ensuring that all system records reflected the corrected authorization status without further discrepancy. Olivia Carter, now back at the gate interface, completed the final synchronization between the boarding system and airline operations database, her earlier uncertainty fully replaced by procedural confirmation. Brandon Hayes stood near the corridor entrance for a moment longer, watching the final passengers board before turning away slowly, his expression no longer carrying confidence or commentary, but a quiet reconsideration of everything he had assumed earlier. Inside the cabin, Ethan adjusted his position slightly, placing his hands calmly in front of him, his gaze directed forward as the aircraft cabin lights shifted into boarding completion mode. A flight attendant approached briefly to confirm final comfort settings, addressing him with a tone that was noticeably more attentive than standard economy interaction, then moved on without lingering. The cabin door began to close, and the sound of final boarding confirmation echoed softly through the aircraft, signaling the end of the entry process. As the aircraft prepared for departure, the environment settled into pre-flight stillness, yet the contrast between the initial treatment at the gate and the final boarding state remained evident in the subtle awareness of those who had observed the sequence unfold. Ethan remained composed, unaffected in outward expression, as though the events leading up to this moment were simply procedural steps within a system that had ultimately aligned correctly. Outside the aircraft, the terminal resumed its normal rhythm, passengers continuing their journeys without interruption. Yet among the staff who had been directly involved, there was a quiet recalibration of understanding that lingered beyond the immediate task. The boarding system logs finalized their updates, confirming elevated clearance recognition without further flag or discrepancy, marking the completion of the correction that had redefined the entire sequence of events. Inside the cabin, the final preparations for departure concluded, and the aircraft entered a state of readiness, carrying forward not only its passengers but also the silent memory of how quickly perception could shift when systems revealed what assumptions had initially concealed. The aircraft had now entered its final pre-departure phase, and the cabin lights shifted into a softer tone that signaled imminent movement. Yet inside the forward section where Ethan Caldwell was seated, there was a subtle atmosphere of continued awareness that extended beyond routine boarding completion. Ethan remained still, his posture relaxed yet attentive, as the cabin crew moved through final safety checks with practiced precision. Around him, passengers settled into silence, fastening seatbelts, adjusting carry-on items, and preparing for departure in a rhythm that felt normal on the surface, but carried a faint undercurrent of curiosity directed toward the man seated in the forward cabin. A flight attendant briefly paused near Ethan's row, confirming seat readiness with a level of respect that was noticeably more deliberate than standard protocol, then continued onward without interruption. Behind him, conversations remained subdued, though occasional murmurs suggested that earlier events at the boarding gate had already become part of informal discussion among passengers who had witnessed or heard fragments of the situation. Ethan's expression remained unchanged, his attention forward, as though the entire sequence of events leading up to this moment had already been fully processed and placed aside. In the cockpit, the flight crew completed final coordination with ground operations, confirming that all boarding irregularities had been resolved and that the aircraft had clearance to proceed without restriction. The communication was brief and procedural, yet it reflected the final alignment of systems that had previously flagged and corrected Ethan's boarding status. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge began to retract slowly, its mechanical motion marking the physical separation between terminal and departure. Inside the cabin, the sound of that movement was faint but noticeable, signaling that the transition from ground to air was now fully underway. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, resting his hands in a composed manner, his demeanor steady as the aircraft cabin shifted from boarding mode to departure readiness. Across the aisle, a passenger glanced at him briefly before looking away, as if reconsidering earlier impressions without needing to articulate them. The flight attendants completed their final walkthrough, securing overhead compartments and confirming passenger readiness, their movements synchronized and efficient, yet occasionally accompanied by brief, respectful glances toward the forward cabin where Ethan remained seated. Marcus Bennett, now back in the terminal operations area, reviewed final system logs confirming that the elevated clearance classification had been fully validated and recorded without exception, ensuring that no further discrepancies remained in the boarding history. Olivia Carter completed her final system entry confirmation, locking the updated authorization into the airline database, her focus now shifting from resolution to closure of the gate process. Brandon Hayes had already moved away from the boarding corridor, his earlier presence replaced by silence, his perspective altered in a way that no longer required external expression. Inside the aircraft, the cabin doors locked with a final mechanical confirmation, and the aircraft entered a state of controlled stillness before taxi clearance. Ethan remained composed, looking forward as the cabin environment stabilized around him, the hum of pre-departure systems becoming the dominant sound. The earlier sequence of misjudgment, delay, and verification no longer existed in active motion, but its impact remained embedded in the quiet awareness of those who had witnessed it unfold. The aircraft received final clearance from ground control, and the pilot's announcement confirmed taxi preparation, marking the transition from terminal procedure to runway movement. Inside the cabin, passengers settled deeper into their seats as the aircraft began to move, the runway lights visible through the windows creating a steady pattern of motion that reflected the shift from uncertainty to completion. Ethan Caldwell remained unchanged in presence, as the aircraft continued forward, carrying with it the quiet record of a system that had once misread, then corrected itself without resistance, restoring order through verification rather than assumption. The aircraft had now reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a steady rhythm of controlled silence, where the soft hum of engines replaced the earlier tension of departure procedures. Ethan Caldwell remained seated in the forward cabin, his posture unchanged, his attention calm and forward-facing, as if the transition from ground uncertainty to airborne stability had not altered his internal focus in any visible way. Around him, passengers gradually shifted into their own routines, some reclining their seats, others adjusting headphones or reviewing personal devices. Yet an unspoken awareness still lingered among a few who had noticed the unusual sequence of events at the boarding gate earlier that evening. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with measured efficiency, offering water and checking on passenger comfort, their tone consistent, though occasionally softening slightly when passing Ethan's row, reflecting a level of acknowledgment that subtly distinguished him from standard passengers without drawing attention. In the cockpit, the pilots maintained steady communication with air traffic control, confirming optimal flight conditions and smooth trajectory, while routine system checks verified that all prior boarding anomalies had been fully resolved and cleared from active status logs. Ethan gently shifted his gaze toward the window, where the city lights below had already transformed into a distant pattern of illumination, shrinking into abstract clusters as the aircraft continued its ascent path. The atmosphere inside the cabin remained calm, yet there was a subtle psychological residue of the earlier sequence of events, as those who had witnessed even fragments of the boarding process found themselves reflecting on the rapid shift from dismissal to verification to full procedural acknowledgment. Across the aisle, a passenger briefly looked toward Ethan before turning away, not out of discomfort, but out of reconsideration, as if recalibrating assumptions that had formed only hours earlier. The flight crew continued their standard service flow, though one attendant paused momentarily near the forward cabin, confirming passenger satisfaction with a level of attentiveness that suggested awareness of Ethan's prior classification within the boarding system. Marcus Bennett, now off duty from direct gate control, had already submitted a final operational report confirming that all system flags associated with Ethan Caldwell had been reviewed, validated, and corrected without residual conflict, ensuring full compliance across airline records. Olivia Carter, in a separate operations terminal, completed her post-departure documentation, noting the unusual but resolved elevation in clearance status, her final entries reflecting procedural closure rather than active uncertainty. Brandon Hayes, seated further back in the cabin, remained quiet throughout the flight's initial phase, no longer engaging in observation or commentary, his earlier confidence replaced by a reflective stillness that mirrored the shift in understanding he had experienced at the gate. Ethan remained composed, unaffected by the attention that had once been directed toward him and now quietly withdrawn, as the aircraft maintained steady flight above the illuminated landscape below. The cabin lighting dimmed slightly as part of the in-flight adjustment phase, signaling the transition into stable cruise conditions, while passengers gradually settled into longer periods of silence or rest. In this environment, the earlier sequence of misjudgment and correction no longer existed as active tension, but rather as an unspoken memory embedded within the awareness of those who had been present at the gate. Ethan Caldwell continued to sit calmly in the forward cabin, his presence unchanged, as the aircraft moved steadily through the night sky, carrying with it the final confirmation of a system that had once questioned, then verified, and ultimately aligned itself with the truth of identity that had been present all along. The aircraft continued its steady cruise through the night sky, maintaining a smooth and stable trajectory as the cabin gradually settled into the quiet rhythm of long-distance travel. Ethan Caldwell remained in the forward cabin, his posture unchanged, his attention calm and forward-facing, as if the earlier sequence of events had been fully absorbed and placed behind him without lingering tension. The cabin lighting remained dimmed, casting a soft ambient glow across the rows of seats, where passengers had now transitioned into rest, reflection, or quiet personal activity. The earlier curiosity that had followed Ethan through the boarding process had faded into a subdued memory among those who had witnessed it, replaced by the normal stillness of mid-flight routine. Flight attendants moved through the aisle with reduced frequency, performing final checks before entering a quieter service phase, their interactions now limited to essential confirmations and passenger comfort adjustments. In the forward section, Ethan sat without movement, occasionally shifting his gaze toward the window where the dark expanse of sky stretched endlessly, interrupted only by faint clusters of light far below. The aircraft maintained a stable altitude, and the hum of the engines provided a consistent background presence that reinforced the sense of controlled motion and distance from the events that had unfolded earlier at the gate. Marcus Bennett, now fully off duty and no longer engaged in active coordination, had submitted the final operational summary confirming that the boarding sequence had been completed without unresolved anomalies, closing the procedural record associated with Ethan Caldwell's elevated clearance status. Olivia Carter, working from the operations center, completed her final post-flight verification entries, ensuring that all system logs reflected accurate alignment between initial flagging and final authorization, her documentation marking the formal closure of the incident without further escalation. Brandon Hayes remained seated several rows behind Ethan, his presence quiet and unremarkable now, his earlier behavior replaced by a subdued awareness that no longer required expression, as the implications of the earlier misunderstanding had fully settled into reflection rather than reaction. Within the cabin, the atmosphere had transitioned fully into long-haul stillness, where only minimal movement and soft ambient sounds remained, reinforcing the separation between earlier procedural intensity and current airborne calm. Ethan adjusted his position slightly, maintaining the same composed demeanor that had characterized his entire journey from gate to cabin.